good stuff.
Welcome back to Drinking with Craig and Roger. I'm Craig.
I'm Roger.
And please, let's do a comprehensive thing, like everything someone needs to know to get started in Scotch.
That sounds like a great idea. And are you aware that 90% of Scotch whiskey is found in blends?
You wouldn't know by going to the store.
Here's one of the blends, Johnny Walker Black. It's been in the barrels 12 years. This bottle of whiskey probably contains the products of at least 30 distilleries.
Oh my goodness.
So
Wow.
What is in the blended Scotch whiskey? There are two main types of Scotch whiskey. One is called malt, and the other is called grain whiskey. The malt whiskey is the most traditional. It's been made that way for 500 years. The malt whiskey is made using a pot still. They moisten the barley and it sprouts. And then traditionally, the Scottish stop it from sprouting by heating it over a fire that's fueled with peat, which is a heavy, dense vegetable matter, which is very common in Scotland. Then later they take this and they turn it into a beer. All whiskey is basically a beer that has been distilled.
Okay.
And then after the beer is done fermenting, they distill it. And they distill it in a pot still, which is a single thing. You start and you stop. So it's a batch process. Now, the same thing sort of is done with grain whiskeys. The grain whiskey in Scotland uses corn as its basic grain. It's made into a beer, and then it's distilled in a column still, which is a continuous process. So they can make it a lot faster than you can make the malt Scotch.
It's the cheaper way to do it.
Yes. Typically with the malts, it's distilled twice, sometimes 3 times, and it's usually about 130 to 135 proof when it's finished and put into the barrels.
Okay.
The grain whiskey is higher, up to 160 proof.
Oh, wow.
And so it's a lighter beverage.
The real difference, you want the malt because it has just so much more complexity and flavor.
Well, that's part of it.
Okay.
Back to history.
Yeah.
All of Scotch whiskey was the single-use malt batch stuff until the 1830s or so, when the continuous still became invented. And they used the continuous still for the same thing. But later, they began to make a lighter whiskey using corn, because around the turn of the 20th century, there was a craving for lighter whiskeys.
Okay.
Now, besides all what we just said, the barrels that it's aged in do have an effect on it. And they will age any whiskey in a number of different barrels. Traditionally, it's a plain oak barrel. The Scots can age up to maybe 3 times in the same barrel.
Wow, okay.
And they use bourbon barrels a lot because bourbon has to be made in a first-use charred oak barrel, and so they can't use it a second time, so they sell it to Scottish distillers who are happy to put, their whiskey in it. They sometimes use sherry barrels and other wine barrels, even beer barrels lately. And the flavor that you get in a malt whiskey then is determined by all of these things. It's determined from the water, where it's made, because the water flows over heather and grass and all sorts of things, and it finally comes down. So that could be in there. Yeah. It could be the way you treat the malt, the amount of smoke from the peat that gets into the grain when you're drying it, the shape of your stills. If they're very tall, it'll produce a lighter whiskey than if they're short. And then when it's aged, what is the barrel like? What does the barrel bring to it? And also, what does the atmosphere around it do? You know, if it's near the ocean, you're probably going to be able to smell a little bit of the ocean in it. Not that it was in the whiskey itself, but that it's gone in
over 12, 16, 20-something years, it made its way in there. Yeah.
And so yeah, the malt whiskey has all these different flavor components. They're all a little different, but they all try and keep their basic product the same, because it's going, 90% of it's going to be sold to be blended.
Right.
And the blenders like to be able to count on the same thing going in there. Otherwise, they have to do a lot of manipulating to get the same taste that their customers have come to expect.
Okay. Can we try this thing?
Oh, do you want to try?
I want to sip on something while I'm listening.
All right.
So with that being said, we're talking about blends. This is a really widely available and affordable one.
Yes. The blends are, there's a wide price range, and a lot of them, are like the inexpensive bourbons. They're meant not to be drunk neat, but to be used in a mixed drink. Mm-hmm. However, there are nice, very fine blends which are meant to be sip neat.
Okay.
This is one. It's not, the most expensive thing, but its cost is right up there with single malts.
Like the entry point single malts. Okay. Johnny Walker Black.
You smell?
Nice, like caramel nose, and
you smell some smoke.
A little bit.
Yep.
It's nice. Not unlike many single malts that I've had.
Well, the single malts are very individual.
Yes.
And when you taste this, and the reason why you blend it is so that it has a consistent characteristic, which is probably found in many different, malts.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of everything you might like in a Scotch whiskey in here, including some smoke.
A little bit.
Yeah, that's
but not. It is not the first thing I detect, and
no,
it's not the main feature.
No, it's not.
But it's in there.
It's in there, yeah. But mostly it's sweet and malty.
It's pretty dang good, I must say. This would be a good start if you're looking for a way to start. One thing just to try, just to see what it's all about. If you've never had anything else, it's a pretty good start.
Yeah,
just give you an idea.
Yeah, it's 80 proof, I think. Isn't it?
It has a 12, and it's aged 12 years. Okay,
it's aged 12 years.
So the youngest thing in there is 12 years old.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that I hadn't said, that the malt whiskey is heavier than the grain whiskey. That's why they put the grain in to make it a lighter beverage. And it's more complex. It takes longer to mature, but the grain whiskey matures much faster. In 3 or 4 years, it's probably as good as it's going to get.
Okay.
Something like that.
Yeah.
But if it's going to be in a 12-year-old blend, the grain whiskey has to be 12 years old too.
Okay.
It's this is the age of the youngest whiskey in it. There could be 16 or 20-year-old.
And that's typically what they do with blends, right? Is you will typically take some grain, some malt, and then some young stuff, and then a little bit of the old stuff, right? Just to kind of create a little bit of a
Absolutely. If you don't see
profile.
an age statement, then you know that they have mixed a lot of different stuff together.
Yeah, and I'm sure they're very, very good at it.
They are. And they're also good at producing a cheap product too. To do that for the market that wants it.
Keep the cost down. Yeah, this is nice. I've never had Johnny Black before, so
yeah, it's very, very, very nice. Anyway, so that's a little bit of taste of this. This is a taste of probably most of Scotland.
Yeah, it's a taste of everything together. But what I'm interested in, I have never had just grain whiskey from Scotland before, but you got one to try.
Absolutely.
Bring it up.
Yeah, when this stuff came out, there was a big Scotch war as to whether malt was going to be the Scotch whiskey, or if this was even a Scotch whiskey, because it wasn't made very much like malt at all.
What is it?
It's William Grant and Sons Black Barrel, which is a single grain Scotch whiskey. It is 40% or 80 proof. It is matured in charred oak which means they use bourbon barrels.
Yep.
It doesn't say anything about how long it's been aged, so I'm going to guess it's maybe 4 to 5 years old.
Okay, let's give it a whirl.
In the barrel.
This is an old. When did you get this bottle? That's how long ago you got this bottle.
Yeah, the cork. Okay,
we might have to pause for a little.
We'll take a pause here until we get cork removal here.
So after a little bit of surgery, we're ready to go with this 20-year-old bottle of single grain whiskey.
Yes. If you have a cork, it probably disintegrates after 20, 30 years. The metal caps don't.
I have never smelled a single grain whiskey.
Well,
is it single grain? Yeah, I mean it's corn, right?
It's corn. Yeah.
So that's all that means when you say single malt, single grain. It just means there's only one kind in there, right?
Well, no, actually, it means it's the product of one distillery.
Ah, okay.
So this is from a single distillery.
I see.
Doesn't have much. It has a very
interesting,
very light.
Very light nose. No smoke, of course, at all. It tastes like a Canadian whiskey to me.
It's a very delicate taste.
Mm-hmm.
It's certainly very different than bourbon made from this.
It's completely different from bourbon, and very different from most of the Scotch that I've had. Any of the Scotch that I've had. Interesting.
It does have a nice taste.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just thinking about this component being in the blend, and how they're kind of using that and the influence that this has.
Taste a little bit of vanilla there.
Definitely. For me, it's like, I don't know, vanilla and caramel. It's it's delicate, but it's a little syrupy almost.
It's
surprisingly thick.
For 80 proof, it's got pretty good.
It's got some heft. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So the grain component by itself isn't bad. It's just not nearly as complex and as the malts.
The grain whiskey, as we've demonstrated, is very light in flavor because it's distilled pretty high. It eliminates a lot of the flavor of the corn.
Mm-hmm.
And even though it's in bourbon barrels, it doesn't pick up a lot of the flavor from the bourbon.
Not at all.
And so you can expect the same thing with other Scotch whiskies that are aged in bourbon barrels. The most of the taste of the charring is in the first use. And so there's only a minimal amount that gets into the second use.
It's a more neutral type of barrel, right? They're using it because it's affordable and it has a nice flavor of its own if it imparts any, right?
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
But if you buy a bourbon barrel aged Scotch, don't expect it to taste like a bourbon.
No, it's a very faint bourbony taste in it.
Yeah. That's often, bourbon barrels are often used they're just used with no mention of it. And so now that bourbon has become so big, you'll start seeing like bourbon barrel aged. It doesn't mean so much. It's not like the special thing it presents.
Yeah.
If you're a big bourbon fan, that's not necessarily the thing you'd want to go to as your little gateway to try, right? Not necessarily.
No, I don't think so. But nonetheless, the grain whiskeys are not available very much, and I have seen one that was a blended grain whiskey, and occasionally you can find some Scotch whiskies that are blended malt whiskeys with no grain in them.
Oh yeah, vatted malt.
Vatted malt is what they used to call them. But anyway, but it will say pure malt.
Pure malt, yeah, those are good. Those can be really good. That one Compass Box does a lot of those. They do a lot of blending of high quality stuff. So blend doesn't necessarily mean bad or low quality.
No. So anyway, so that's the one side. This is nice. Probably 20 to 30% of a blended whiskey if it's a good blended whiskey, and maybe 50 to 60% if it's the cheaper one. Because this is by far cheaper than the malt whiskeys to make. Anyway, I think that's about all you really need to know about this kind of whiskey. But let's talk about the other kind of whiskey that is more traditional.
The big one.
We're on to the single malts.